Hello and welcome to the Wildcard Rewind. Oh, I can't talk today already. It's only 3 days until the start of the NFL season, so we're going to go and get you ready and prepped for week 1. Let's get to it.
I just want to rewind to when we were young at heart. Back to all those good times. Take me back to the start.
Well, after my fantastic start to the pod, I think it's going to be a fantastic evening. Thankfully, I have Lewis here to keep me company and keep me on the straight and narrow. How are you this evening, Lewis?
I'm good, thank you, Hannah. Really excited. We've obviously been putting in quite a lot of work for our in-season format, so we've got a really exciting kind of new bumper show put together for everyone today. And also, it's 3 days until football starts again, or three and a bit for us UK based, because I'm not going to stay up until 1 o'clock in the morning to watch it, even though I do think it'll be a really good first game. But it's football week. We're back to football week again.
I know, I'm really, really excited. Although I've started kind of looking through my teams and looking at setting lineups and everything, and I'm like, this is going to be a long 17 weeks.
I did too many startups this off season. I forgot how difficult it was to manage. Too many charity leagues this year. Have you counted at all how many lineups you've got to set each week?
I haven't yet this year. I actually think it might be less than last year. I was really restrained because I remembered last year how much it was just hurt me by the end of, by the end of that last week. I was like, this is just too much. So I've done a lot more best ball actually this year, and a few less kind of redraft dynasty, just to try and help, because it can be a challenge, can't it?
Yeah, I think I'm up to something like 17 or 18 managed leagues, which like is a lot, but it's just charity competitions is really the kicker for me that I can't help myself from going into another one. I'm just constantly amazed at like so many of the friends that I have that have like 30 dynasty leagues. That I'm like, how is that even fun in season? Like I have, I think 11 or 12. I can barely remember what's going on in any of them. I've had to like come up with spreadsheets to manage what's going on. Like it's just not fun when it's Wednesday evening or like Thursday afternoon in the UK, and you're like, right, I have to set every single lineup, and then I need to go back and redo it. I need to think about, okay, is my opponent playing, and okay, got to get my early players into the positional slots, take them out the flexes, and like it's great fun. I love this hobby so much. There are some moments that you're like, I might have shot the moon a bit this week. I might have overdone it.
Yeah, no, I am exactly the same. That is the one thing that I sometimes struggle with. I'm like, oh, not another one, not another one. Setting waivers actually is the thing that I find the most challenging. I'm like scrolling through, all the same players. Like, how much do I want them on my team? But anyway, we've got all this fun to come. Before we do that, let's start doing and breaking down, I suppose, a little bit what our thoughts are for week 1. So we've got some, like you said, Lewis, some really exciting content going for in season. And we'll start with that format this week to give everyone an idea of what kind of is going to be coming across to them every week on a Monday evening. So we'll start with our first one, which is big news of the week. There's been actually quite a lot of big news this week, and unfortunately, it's been to quite a lot of our kind of stud players, which is a little bit upsetting. So we did discuss this guy a little bit last week, but obviously things have developed since last week. And Jonathan Taylor, he didn't have that trade that we were kind of discussing where we thought he might go. And unfortunately, I think it is probably unfortunately, he's still a Colt at this time. The most upsetting news, though, that he has now gone onto the PUP list and he's set to miss a minimum of 4 games, possibly more this season. So there are still some people doing these last-minute drafts. So, Lewis, kind of what do you think on drafting Jonathan Taylor at this point? Are you doing it at all, or are you totally out? And then for anybody who's already drafted him, how do you think they can potentially save their seasons? Is there anyone in that backfield that you might be interested in?
So to think about the kind of the first question first, if you're still drafting, but that does make you a degenerate if you're still going at this point, or your league is very poorly organized if you're 3 days before the season. I have a slow draft that hasn't finished yet. I have
Me
a home
too.
league. I have a home league that's still going, but that wasn't the question. Um, I think you can draft him. I think it just depends on cost and build. In a lot of best ball drafts that I've been doing across the last month or so, when we've known that it was likely he might get traded, his ADP obviously started to slip. I couldn't really bring myself to take him because you sort of, his ADP started at the back of the first, and then it was towards the back of the second, maybe early third. And at that point, there were still a lot of other players that I was more interested in taking than JT, who were just a little bit safer. I actually heard a story from a friend of seeing JT go around the eighth round, in which case I think you can. I think there's no world in which he should be going later than Alvin Kamara, who we know is going to be suspended for the first few games, and even when he comes back, doesn't have the upside that JT does. The passing of kind of so him going on pup obviously doesn't mean that he won't get traded at some point, and he absolutely could as we approach the trade deadline if they lower the cost a little bit. Um, I don't I don't really like labeling him as this because I think it's quite easy to make the argument against it. But like JT could be a league winner this year if he gets the full workload when he comes back after 4 games, and we've seen Dion Jackson, Evan Hull, and like maybe even a Kareem Hunt or Leonard Fournette like not really making it work, and they go, do you know what's great? You're our 3 down back again. He could end up, if you get him late enough, being a league winner. It just depends on cost in terms of where you get him. If you can get him in the 8th round, he's more likely to contribute to your team than anyone else you're going to get around that point. In terms of if you already are a JT manager, first of all, like you should have gone out and got Dion Jackson. I think he's going to be the starter. I spoke about him a lot on the Dynasty podcast on Tuesday last week. About the fact that I don't think he's a good player, but running back is a volume-based position, and therefore, if he's going to be the starter, if any back's going to be the starter for their offense, you can probably plug in and play them. The crucial thing for me with any JT manager is I think you need to view your team's build differently. So if you went in for a strong too early running back build, you now have a hero RB build. If you went in for a hero RB build, which is where you take one early and let them anchor your team, and then don't take other running backs till later. If you went in for a hero running back build with JT, you now have a 0 running back build. Like you just have to start viewing it slightly differently and then adapting the way that you play to the strategy you would have taken. So a lot of that will mean playing the waiver wire quite heavily to look for opportunities for kind of backup running backs. Whether it's a case of like, oh, CMC's got injured, so I need to go and pick up Elijah Mitchell, or whether it's a case of going someone like Chuba Hubbard, like if Miles Sanders gets injured, he's going to be a very heavy volume player. So like I'm going to pick up those sorts of players so that I'm more prepared for someone who could potentially break out and really get a lot of volume. I think that's the thing. You need to be very active on the waiver wire and really start like taking shots at running back to make sure that you can see yourself for the first few weeks where JT's not going to be helping you out.
Yeah, I think you made a really great point there about Alvin Kamara. Why should he be going after Alvin Kamara when we already know Alvin Kamara will not be there for the first 3 games? The thing that makes me nervous now at this point with JT is, are we going to see him at all this season? And I fear that they don't want to trade him because they feel that he is worth more than anybody is offering. And he doesn't want to play for them. So I fear we've kind of reached this impasse where nobody's going to budge, and ultimately he stays on PUP for the whole season, and then it gets figured out next off season. That's the thing that makes me nervous about JT. I personally am not sure I can, even in the 8th, I can necessarily pull the trigger. Now, this is where I would probably lose because someone else would take him and he will come back after 4 weeks. But I am more of I do like to draft for upside, but I'm a bit more of a nervous drafter. I'm a bit safer in that respect.
Yeah, just more risk averse.
Yeah. I mean that would be the better term to put it. Yeah, just a bit more risk averse, and I just have this fear that I don't think he wants to play for them. I don't think they want to trade him, and I think ultimately we're stuck in this impasse. Now, like you say, when it comes to the trade deadline and they've had a load of dead leggers playing for them, it might be they say, right, okay, fine, we've changed our mind, and they figure it out from there. But just where the way everything is at the moment, I'm not convinced he'll be back, but I could be totally wrong there, and someone could go on and win the league because they've drafted him in the 8th round. So, unfortunately, another stud player. We've had some more concerning news about Cooper Cup and his hamstring injury.
Ah,
I know that is really upsetting.
ah.
I've got loads of him this year, which is it's very upsetting. But we've heard that he's travelling to see a specialist to try and find out what is the root cause of the hamstring injury. That does make me nervous and makes me think that this is more is going on than they're letting on. Now they're saying he's day to day, but I'm not sure I necessarily believe that. But how worried are you about it, Lewis? And again, a similar thing to JT. Are you drafting Cup?
So, do you want my real answer, or do you want my kind of very, very excited type answer from a Rams fan perspective?
Let's hear your real answer first.
Yeah, I'm worried about Cooper Cup. Soft tissue injuries are the sort of thing that can genuinely be a problem and be a recurring issue. They're more likely to recur. It's in the way that we often talk about kind of what does injury prone mean? Like if a player's got injured a couple of times, but one time he broke his finger and the next time he broke his toe, well, those things are unrelated. But if a player has repeated hamstring injuries, that is more likely to reoccur. The fact that he's suddenly, he was injured last season and he was injured a little bit during training camp, and now he's suddenly day to day, it worries me, especially given that this is his age 30 season. Cooper Cup is an elite fantasy wide receiver. I argued a couple of weeks ago that I think he will be the wide receiver one. I would now probably take that back and just go for the safer Justin Jefferson because I think if Cooper Cup's going to miss week one, I think, and any sort of missed time means that JJ is gonna beat you out. So to me, like again, it does come down to cost. Like he has huge league winning upside. He has league winning upside. Like I said, if you get him after like the 105, like let alone if you manage to get him in the second or even the third, if people are scared of him. So like, yeah, I'd absolutely take him. Um, would it surprise me at this point if this ended up being a bigger thing and this season was a sort of he misses the first 2 weeks, then he comes back and he puts up 25 points a game for a couple of weeks, and then we're not sure if he's going to play, and then he misses a week, but then he comes back and then it's all right. And if it was that sort of season where like you're just never confident in putting him in your lineup, it I'd love as a Rams fan to be very optimistic and be like, no, they've said day to day, he'll probably miss week one, he'll probably be back by week two, and then he'll be fine. Um, as a also a Rams fan that obviously like sees it very emotionally, were it to transpire that this were kind of the end of Cooper Cup as an elite fantasy wide receiver, I also wouldn't be surprised. If this was kind of the age 30 season, starting to have soft tissue injuries, starting to be on the way out, it wouldn't surprise me. I don't like saying it, but it wouldn't surprise me.
So go on, make us feel a bit better now, Lewis. What's your upbeat Rams opinion?
Coaches would come out and say if he was more injured than he actually was. They said day to day, he'll probably miss week one, but he'll be back by week two, and then he'll be wide receiver one by week 17.
Well, that would be nice. I mean, as a cup owner myself, I'm desperate for that to happen, but I fear for your first kind of scenario, Lewis, which is going to
Yeah,
be it comes back injured again, comes back injured again, and we see him for like 4 weeks of the year in total. When he plays, he's a stud, but he doesn't play enough to warrant that first round pick that he took. Just really
yeah.
quickly before we move on, as a Rams fan, I want to tap into you here now, Lewis. Is there any wide receivers here that we should be going out and targeting on the waivers if they're there?
I mean, all of them are on waivers. So yeah, like Van Jefferson, I think is probably the answer. The problem is like obviously running back and wide receiver aren't the same. Like with JT out, we can go and start Deion Jackson. We can't really handcuff in the same way at wide receivers. Like it could be anyone. Van Jefferson is the one that I would feel the most confidence in starting if Cooper Cup were to miss week one. But when I say the most confidence, it's still like a 4 out of 10. Like I'm not actively confident about Van Jefferson, just more so than Tutu Atwell and Demarcus Robinson and Puka Nakua and all of those very exciting names.
And do you think Higby now gets a bit of a bump here?
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. All of like I mean, Cooper Cup's an incredibly versatile player, but obviously primarily plays out of the slot. So any of the underneath work that you might see playing out of the slot, Tyler Higbee should see instead. Tyler Higbee, I think, should be feeling very confident week one. But I think with Higbee, whether Cup plays or not, you should be quite confident in him.
Yeah, it's a shame really, because I think, Matt Stafford and Cooper Cup, I think people have been really down on them this off season, and I think not Cup necessarily, but I mean ultimately the Rams as a team, and I think that connection those two have really would kind of show people how much value there still is in that team, particularly for fantasy. I do
Yeah.
think Matthew Stafford unfortunately gets a bit of a knock because there's no Cup here, but I think those two together, and Higby kind of on the side, that they are reasonably elite, and I think people have kind of forgotten that, and they're kind of writing Matt Stafford off, and I think unfortunately he's probably not going to be able to show how good he is without Cup, to be honest. So just quickly before we move on, one more backfield literally we've been talking about for the whole off season is a Dolphins backfield. Now they've come out and said that Jeff Wilson has gone and been put on IR. So again, he is also out for the first 4 weeks. So how kind of do you see this backfield shaking out, Lewis? Is there someone you're targeting here? Is it Mostert, or do you think that A-Chain could start to kind of work in there a little bit? And where do you think we are between kind of week 1 and week 4, really?
Well, they've actually just said that Devon A-Chain should be practicing before week one. Raheem Mostert should absolutely be like a best ball target for week one. Like I think he will get a tremendous amount of volume. Um, and he only really needs one touch to take the ball to the house. He's playing the Chargers, who are one of the worst run defenses last year. So like if Raheem Mostert was the RB1 this week, I wouldn't be hugely surprised. I'm actually quite happy putting him in my starting lineup because of that, and I think I will be until I'm shown otherwise. The thing with Mostert is he's very injury prone himself. They obviously took A-Chain quite high. And there's still, they clearly wanted to go and get JT, so they clearly don't see A-Chain as like the elite bell cow. There's still Kareem Hunt out there. There's still Fournette out there. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if Hunt ended up on the Dolphins. But Mostert, I would be very, very excited to start week one. I wouldn't. I think Mostert is going to score a lot of points on a lot of benches in week one.
Yeah, I mean, this is the time to start him, right? For me, as the season goes on, I get more nervous about him because I think ultimately he gets tired. He is older now, and probably A-Chain will feel more, comfortable in the backfield. Jeff Wilson comes back, and that's when we kind of start losing kind of faith and trust in Mostert. Like, this is your time now, week one. They trust him, he's the healthiest, he's going to go out and bowl out, and then ultimately I think he's kind of going to lose value as the season goes on. So I totally agree, this is the time to start him if you've got him, really. So let's move on to our next segment, Lewis. Rewind the tape. Now, in this season, in this segment, we're going to discuss things that we've learned basically from the previous week that we feel helps us as fantasy managers. Maybe it's something we've seen, something that we've found with our own teams, whatever that might be. We're going to bring it to the table, and hopefully that will help us and you as we move forward through the season. Now, obviously, the season hasn't started yet. So this week, we're going to look back at last season and give you something that we've learned from last season that we feel is going to help us and you moving forward to this season. So, Lewis, what is this thing that you learned from last season that's going to help you this season?
I've got a couple of things. The first one is something we've actually really just touched on, which is being injured in the past doesn't make you injury prone. This was a really big thing in terms of who was the 101 in 2022. Was it Jonathan Taylor or was it Christian McCaffrey? And the safe bet was always Jonathan Taylor because CMC had just been injured. And then JT was injured for the majority of the season. Like, I think it's really a case of just because a player has been injured previously doesn't mean you have to worry about them being injured again. Like, I get it quite a lot with Tua this offseason that I'm like, I know he was concussed and I know he potentially looked to retire, but he decided to not. Like, and having a lot of time off is what will cure any sort of concussion history. So I'm not taking any sort of I'm not like drafting him at a discount because I think that he might get a concussion again, because if you were drafting players with the the idea that they might get injured, then we just wouldn't draft any running backs. Like they all could potentially get injured. So I think to me, like unless you are looking into like the kinds of injuries that people are getting recurring and whether or not they're things that medically are then more likely to recur, then I don't think it's just as simple as saying, oh, but so and so was injured last year, so they're probably going to get injured again. Like we're not doctors, and I think a lot of the time as fancy players, we like to speak too much over medical issues than we actually should be. So yeah, I think kind of don't label people with injury prone unless you've actually looked into the evidence of whether their injury does make them injury prone.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point, isn't it? And I think a lot of people kind of shied away or have shied away historically from players because they have been injured the season before and they've been burnt. And I totally get it, you know, having that stress throughout the whole of the season, you know, it does turn you off players, but I think you need to keep an open mind, you know, and like you say, depending on what the cause is, how early it was in the season, you know, will depend on as and when that individual will come back and how well they'll be kind of performing in that next season. The one kind of thing that I think does buck that trend a little bit, which again it's probably pertinent for this season, ACL tears, they make me nervous the season after.
Yeah.
And I totally understand that not all ACL tears is the same. One might just be a clean tear of the ACL, others it's multiple other you know, tendons involved, it's the menisci. You know, we know that Javonte, his injury is different from Breece Hall, but a study has shown that ultimately, you know, players that have had an ACL tear the season before will have a drop in fantasy performance and fantasy points accrued over the next season. Now, it might be with Breece that that's all at the beginning half of the season. And if we can ride it out, fine. He might be a stud by the second half. But they still make me nervous drafting them. And like for me, like J.K. Dobbins is like the worst case scenario last season of that kind of injury, because we know, you know, he came on the field very rarely. When he did play towards the end of the season, he was actually pretty good, but he missed a lot of the season with that injury. And obviously you'll have drafted him reasonably high. I mean, obviously he wasn't a first or second round pick, but he still was a reasonable opportunity cost on your team, and he gave you very, very little. So they still make me nervous, and people do still try and push, you know, take this guy. Yes, he had an injury, but by the end of the season, he's going to be great. And in some cases, great. I'm sure that will happen. Breece Hall may well do that. Someone like Javonte Williams makes me nervous.
Yeah, I think that's completely fair enough.
That's the only thing about injuries. You said you had another one for us.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is tight end based. The way I've thought about it is get an elite tight end or don't bother. But actually, when I thought about this a little bit more, it's basically a league-winning tight end or don't bother. It's not just a case of pay up for a tight end. It's if your tight end isn't essentially Travis Kelce or Mark Andrews from a couple of years ago, it does not matter who you play. And I was looking through some of the scoring from last year, looking at both kind of actual finishes and then obviously points per game to prove like a slightly more helpful metric in terms of how, like, was it just injury based? Was it small sample size, or did they actually help your team? So their tight end two last year was TJ Hawkinson, behind Travis Kelce. I think something like 120 points behind Travis Kelce, like it wasn't even close. He was tight end 5 in points per game, and in half PPR, he finished on 10.1 points per game. So having a look at this in terms of other positions, keeping in mind that Travis Kelce would have finished as a wide receiver 1, I think it's something like wide receiver 4 or 5 last year. TJ Hawkinson would have finished at wide receiver 34 last year. So a low end wide receiver 3. He was just above DJ Moore, who we all think was a bust last year, like didn't help our teams at all. So my thinking then is like, why are you then paying up for a tight end who isn't really going to help your team that much? Like if you were going to get you wouldn't draft a wide receiver 3 in kind of the 4th or 5th round, or someone who's going to finish as a wide receiver 3. But then when you look at the difference between him and someone like, so I was looking further down, like David Njoku, finished at tight end 13 in points per game, was tight end 11. The difference was only 2 points per game. So like you could have waited 5, 6, 7 rounds and taken someone at tight end who was going to get 2 points less per game, which isn't really going to lose you a week. Those extra 2 points a game at the tight end position for the opportunity cost is not really going to affect you that much. So I think to me, like that was even more evidence for kind of paying up for a Travis Kelce or Mark Andrews, or not bothering and taking someone right at the end.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great point, isn't it? I'm not a massive fan of paying for those kind of middle round ends. Although I do feel like, I don't know whether you've noticed this at all this season, but I do think like the price of the tight ends have increased. Like people are starting to take them a lot earlier. I mean, fair enough, Kelce, Andrews, Hawkinson, whatever, fine. Pay up for them in the higher rounds. But I'm finding, often Njoku, Dallas Goddard, they're going in like the 5th and 6th round, where historically you'd find, at least like the Njoku type players, you could get them in like the 9th type round. So I'm often finding if I'm waiting till the 10th, I'm scraping, which is fine, because often half the time you end up dropping them for waivers, because someone's popped up on waivers who is fantastic and you want that guy. But I do think even those, I suppose maybe it's just that the middle round landscape is changing, but even what I would consider like the upside, low end tight ends, like a Higby, I do find that he's sometimes going off the board before I can even think about him, because people are taking him much quicker. Now, obviously, some of these are tight end premium leagues, but generally, I think people, they want to, because it's a spot on your roster, and you have to start tight end, they just want to fill it. And they want to get their starting lineup done, out of the way, and then I can think about my bench. They're not thinking, where can I get the best value? They're thinking, right, I want to fill up my starters, and then I'll, deal with everything else. And that's not always the best way to think, as you've just said. So mine is actually not necessarily based on the season itself, but just based on, I suppose, some of my observations as I went through with my league. So for me, it was a case of, if you are like a big underdog in your matchup, basically go big or go home. So don't put someone in like I don't know, I'm trying to think of someone who's going to be a steady Eddie. Let's say Tyler Boyd.
Mm-hmm.
No point putting Tyler Boyd, personally, I don't think, in your flex spot, because I think he's got a reasonable floor, but not much of a ceiling. You want to be putting someone like Rashid Shaheed in, where he had those odd games where he scored like 2 touchdowns and got those really long receptions and ended up with 15 points. Look, if he falls flat on his face, you were going to lose anyway. You're a massive underdog. But if he does go off, then he's potentially just won you a week that you thought you were going to lose. So when you're looking at your flexes, often you'll fill up your, starting, players with your studs or whoever you got in the first few rounds potentially. Then you're looking at your flexes. So be bold, look at matchups, look at, who's got an injury or whatever, and put the upside guy in your flex spot. Don't be scared to do that, because if he gives you a 0, what does it matter? You were going to lose anyway. But if he gets you 15, that could squeak you through to a win.
Yeah, I there was a championship that I won a couple of years ago, and that's the end of the story. I just want to show off. No, there's a championship I won a couple of years ago in a home league, and there was one player in the lineup that I'd actually drafted. Like all the rest of them were just waiver wire pickups, and it was, oh, which backup running back was it that absolutely went off? I have a feeling it was for the Chargers, but I can't remember who it was. But it was like a couple of backup running backs, and like I think Antonio Brown was on there. Like it was all players that I really tried to play for matchups and gone like, if I'm going for the relatively safe options, then I'm definitely going to lose this. But if I can try and be really smart about who can actually win me this matchup, And in the end, they did. So yeah, like absolutely. I also remember getting knocked out of the playoffs by Mikael Hardman one year, like because he happened to get 2 touchdowns. Like absolutely trying to win the week as opposed to kind of playing safe if you're the underdog going into it. Definitely a very smart way to play.
Yeah, I think so. And I also think people sometimes don't kind of think enough about their flex spots. They think, right, who is kind of the next best player that I can put in my flex? But actually, that's not always the case. Like, he could be a better player, but if he's being matched up with a good corner, or, it's a bad matchup for the quarterback or whatever that might be, you want to look at your matchups, who are they playing? What are their weaknesses? And where potentially is the team going to kind of try and expose those? And that might be throwing bombs to Rashid Shaheed. He's in one I can think of right now, so I keep bringing him up. But or it might be that backup running back is going to get a ton of volume. So put them in, even if they're not as good a player. Particularly for running backs, as you said earlier, Lewis, volume is king. So.
Yeah. Hannah's actually not mentioned, but we're actually sponsored specifically by Rashid Shaheed to mention him 3 times an episode.
As many times as we can. I wonder if we can sneak him into some of our next kind of segments through the course of the season.
Is he your stud of the week? Is that where you're going?
How did you guess? So, as Lewis hinted, our next segment is Fantasy Stud of the Week. So this is where we're going to have a look at an under the radar player that we think can overperform and exceed expectations in the next week coming up. So obviously for us this week, we are predicting week 1. So Lewis, who do you think is going to perform or overperform next week?
I've got a couple, and I think one of the things we've been talking about with this section is really, it's not useful in start sets where people are like, I think Justin Jefferson's going to have a good week. Like really trying to look at kind of some of the under radar players that might be available on waivers or might be kind of later round targets that you can get. So the two that I've gone for, Marvin Jones. Might be kind of in his mid 30s now, but was brought back by the Lions this offseason. They are obviously missing Jameson Williams. So the only players potentially above him in the depth chart. Obviously, we know Amon-Ra St. Brown, potentially Josh Reynolds, but as a previous Rams player, like he's not really all that. I think Marvin Jones, even at this point, is a better receiver. One of the interesting things for me is like missing Jameson Williams, and obviously they brought in Jahmyr Gibbs, who might play some receiver as well. But it's more likely with Amon-Ra is mostly a slot only receiver. Jahmyr Gibbs, can catch out of the backfield, but like if you're gonna play him as a receiver, you're more likely to play him kind of shallow and underneath. Marvin Jones is an outside receiver and is a really good end zone threat. They're playing Kansas City week 1, so like they're likely to have to throw a lot. I wouldn't be surprised to see him kind of get a touchdown or massively overperform where he's currently going. Bear in mind where he's currently going is like undrafted, like he will be on your waivers. And if you find yourself in a situation where you need a spot start, I think he could be a really interesting one. My other stud of the week, and this is the debate about like the believability of training camp reports. Romeo Doubs for the Green Bay Packers. They're playing the Bears this week, so obviously not a fantastic defense. We don't know whether or not Jordan Love is any good. But reports all throughout training camp were that Romeo Doubs was Jordan Love's favorite target. Obviously, Christian Watson is the higher priced receiver, and they just went out and drafted Jaden Reed quite high as well in the second round. So Doubs is kind of as a previous 5th round pick going a little bit under the radar. But if the training camp reports were right, then he could be for quite an interesting week, especially against a team without like an established CB1 that can take him out of the game. So I think he could be an interesting one. And again, he's most likely available on waivers. So Marvin Jones, Romeo Doubs, we'll have a chat about them next week and see if either of them do anything. They are kind of risky ones, but I think they could be under the radar players who could potentially overperform.
Yeah, I think they're great. Lewis, again, like you say, they're guys you can pick up and spot start if you need. I've gone a bit higher. I haven't gone stud, but this guy is going to be on a team, so maybe I need to look a bit deeper for next week. But and again, when I was thinking about this, he may or may not go off, but my choice is Jahan Dotson. You know that they're playing Arizona, who are basically going to be really terrible. Terry McLaurin is not practicing at the moment with his turf toe, and he still hasn't been at practice. I would be surprised if he suits up for week one. He might, but I could see him being limited if he does. So ultimately, I think Jahan Dotson is going to be the wide receiver one on this team. Now, if Arizona is bad as we think they're going to be, there is a chance that they're going to start running the ball quite a lot. But I do think that Jahan Dodson has a role to play here. And I do think he could put up some really decent numbers this week before they turn to running the ball all the time. And this will link on to one of my other segments a bit later on as well. So that's my thoughts there. So we'll see. I could fall flat on my face here, and actually I should have said Brian Robinson instead, but we'll see.
Yeah, it's interesting. We went with three receivers. That was very unplanned. Also, a fourth with obviously Rashid Shaheed as well.
Oh, of course, he's definitely going to be a wide receiver one. I'm sure of it. Yeah, I was after I'd written John Dodson, and I was thinking about it on the train home this evening. I was like, shall I change it to Brian Robinson? But I was like, oh, I just really like Jahan Dodson here.
Yeah,
Like,
he's great.
there is nobody else. Ultimately, I think Antonio Gibson is going to have some sort of role. Be interesting to see what split this backfield has this week. I'm excited to see that, but Dotson has no one ahead of him. We've all got excited about him, I think, or a lot of people have this offseason. So I'm hoping he's going to show his talent and get some good fantasy points for us this week. So kind of going to the flip side here, Lewis, we're going to talk about fantasy scare of the week. So this is where we're going to have a look at hyped up players who we think are going to probably underperform and upset us and our fantasy teams, and potentially give us an L this week when we thought that they were going to be the stud player that carries us to the win. So who's your potential fantasy scare of the week?
Yeah, again, I like sticking in with the like go big or go home theme. Like, I want with this, we're not saying bad players that are going to underperform. Like each week, you end up people that you really relied on putting up duds. I've gone for a couple. Um, and I've tried to think of kind of outside factors that could affect them. That's not just a case of like I think they could underperform. So the two that I've gone with, Stephon Diggs playing the Jets this week. The only reason for this is because he obviously has missed some bits of camp with whether it's injuries, whether it's diva-itis, conversations about new contracts. He's missed a little bit of camp. Like I don't think it's going to matter too much, but it's worth bringing up. But the main reason that I went for this is just Sauce Gardner watch. Like I think Sauce Gardner, if he's not already the best corner in the NFL, then we're going to start consensus calling him that by the end of this season. So I just don't feel great about playing anyone versus him. I wouldn't be surprised if it's his role just to shut down Stephon Diggs as well. And I think Diggs is the sort of player that if Gardner starts getting under his skin, he won't be happy about it, and he'll start throwing his toys out of the pram. So I think he could be a really interesting one. The other player that I went with is Derrick Henry. Derrick Henry actually is quite an interesting player for this off season because obviously he has been elite the last few years, and we know everything he can do. But it's not looking fantastic at the moment. Like he's age 29 season. The Titans offensive line looks absolutely terrible. It was the lowest rated by PFF going into this season. The Saints that they're playing, that their D line is quite a strength. Um, he's also the thing with Derrick Henry is he gets better as it gets later into the season as it starts to get colder. And when I was actually looking at his week one performances the last few years, um, I'm not going to go back to 2019 because he absolutely crushed it that year. 2020, 15.1 points, so pretty good. 2021, 9.7 points. Yeah. 2022, 7.2 points, pretty bad. Like, I think he's a really interesting one because there's a path to him really underperforming this year, and especially towards the beginning of the year. I could see it not really working for him, especially with how terrible their offensive line is.
Yeah, really interesting, and I agree. Derrick Henry's a tough one, isn't he? Totally agree with you there. Last season, I was like, no, he's done. He's going to be, he's going to get injured or he's not going to perform as he has been. And he was a complete stud, apart from in the finals week of Scottish Bowl when they sat him. That was very, very upsetting. But other than that, he was a massive stud. But this season, I feel really quite nervous about him. And I'm like, at some point, the wheels have to fall off. Like, he has had
Yeah,
so many touches. Like, the wheels have got to go at some point. And I can't shake off the feeling that it might be this season. But again, I could be totally wrong, and he could be a complete stud going into kind of the playoff time. But yeah, great point. He's always struggled in week one, so it'd be interesting to see. Now, my possible fantasy scare of the week is Devontae Adams. Now, before people say, "Oh, how dare you say Devontae Adams?" Like, we know he's fantastic, and it's not him per se. Like, we know he can play against anyone, but he just doesn't seem happy. Like we saw in the off
yeah,
season, he's shouting out Josh McDaniels. He's not happy where he is. We have no idea how things are going to look with Jimmy G under centre. I actually think he's probably a downgrade to Derek Carr, to be honest.
yeah. I agree.
And people are, I think, quite off on the Broncos. Like, I think Russell Wilson is just putting everyone off. But that defense is really good. Like, they've
Yeah,
got some great players on there, and he'll likely be shadowed by Pat Satan. Now, I'm not saying he's going to totally shut him down, but I think he's not going to make it easy. He's one of, I think, the best cornerbacks in the league.
yeah,
So he's not going to make it easy for him. And as I say, it's the Jimmy G factor, it's the Josh McDaniels factor, it's the what's Las Vegas even doing this season factor that I think Devontae Adams is definitely going to have some dud weeks this season, like he did last season. And I am predicting that week one might be one. Now, I could fall flat on my face and he could score 30 points and be the wide receiver one this week. But week one, I'll always put him in my starting lineup. I'm not saying I'm taking him out, but I do think he has the chance of laying an egg.
yeah. I can see it. Well, this is the point. We're going for these are hot takes. We're going for players that are consensus elite, playing up those numbers each week. So like, there's a chance we're going to end up with egg on our faces. But like Dante Adams, I can absolutely see it. I think one of the weird things is last year for the Raiders, despite Devontae Adams is like ultimate kind of like unicorn type weapon, like can be used however you want, can really be successful all three levels of the field. The Raiders used him as a deep threat. Like he caught more passes down the field than he had for a good few years. And if that's the skill set he started to kind of get used to, well, Jimmy G's not going to do that. So for the third year in a row, it's kind of learning a new way of working with a different quarterback that might want to work in a completely different way. So I can see it not really working out.
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? And I do wonder if if you gave him some kind of truth serum, whether he would have wished that he never actually had left the Packers.
Yeah, definitely. He went to play with his best friend. Imagine you move to a new town, you live with your best friend, and then your best friend moves away to a different town,
I
or that
know,
that town chases him out.
you'd be gutted, wouldn't you? And then you're stuck there. God, I know,
Yeah.
poor guy. I do feel sorry for him. Anyway, moving on to our final segment of the show. This is going to be fun, and I think we're going to have some fun times with this. So, obviously, with our fantasy, studs and duds, I suppose, we will review them next week and see who's got egg on their face coming out of here. But this is the segment I'm most excited for. Wildcard of the week. So this is our actual hot take of the week that we think could and should happen in week one, but obviously we're being a bit wild here, so they may not necessarily happen, but we can see a path to them happening.
Yeah.
So, okay, Lewis, give us your wild card.
I think in week one, we will learn that Rashad Penny is the Eagles running back that we should have been drafting. The Eagles backfield is a really interesting one this offseason, and like going at a range of prices. And I actually, again, like when I was talking with the Dynasty podcast on Tuesday, noted Kenneth Gainwell as like a real value, but like DeAndre Swift is going quite high. Kenny Gainwell's going quite low. Rashard Penny's going in the middle. I think he's being drafted as like the RB39 at the minute. Um, they went out and acquired Rashard Penny without the intention of bringing in DeAndre Swift. Like the Eagles are very opportunistic, so they went and got DeAndre Swift because first of all they love players from Georgia, but also the Lions drafted Jahmyr Gibbs, so clearly there was an opportunity. But like they went out and signed Rashard Penny. That is the player they went out and targeted and signed. Rashard Penny is such a talented running back and seems to be healthy at the minute. That's obviously been the only question with him is health. Behind the Eagles' offensive line, with all of the opportunity brought up by a mobile quarterback and two elite wide receivers as well, I think there's a world in which Rashard Penny could be an absolute stud this year if he sees a big enough share of that backfield. And I think in week one we could be surprised and find out that he's actually the RB1 in Philadelphia.
I would totally love that. I would really. I think that would be great. I started getting a bit nervous about him just from the shares that he was getting in the preseason. You
Yeah,
know, he was coming in relatively late. They weren't giving him many touches of the ball, and that just makes me a bit nervous. And I'd heard in training camp that they'd been using Kenny Gainwell a lot. Now it might just be that Kenny Gainwell, he knows the system already, and they just,
yeah,
you want to stick with who knows the system, early in the season. But ultimately, these guys will get up to speed with that. And I do think if you give Penny enough, he will show how talented he is, and he just needs the
yeah,
opportunity, like you said. So they may have already seen that now in the final throes of kind of preseason and training
yeah,
camp, that he comes out as the RB1. I'm really excited to see how this is going to shake out. My suspicion is that Kenny Gainwell is going to be a massive value at the beginning of the season,
yeah. I
and
agree.
then he will peter out. And by the end of the season, if Rashard Penny is healthy enough, I could see him coming out as the RB1.
Yeah,
Otherwise, I can't see DeAndre Swift taking this for himself. I think if he ends up being the RB1, then it's going to be some sort of timeshare. Whereas
yeah.
I think
I
if
agree.
Rashard Penny stays healthy, he could
Yeah.
potentially take a lot of the work.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And like I think he's the most talented running back there. So if he's healthy, I think it makes sense.
Yeah, I would love to see him succeed, because there are a few games, weren't there, not last season before, where he really looked fantastic, and
Yeah,
you just feel sorry for him. Like, he's had so many different injuries. You just want him to succeed, don't you?
I know.
So my hot take wildcard this week is that, and people are probably going to be surprised about me saying this because I've been off Sam Howell for the whole of the offseason, but I think that Sam Howell will finish as a top 12 quarterback in week one. So this is mainly because they're playing Arizona, to be honest.
Yep.
And, we know that he can use his legs. We know that, they've been very happy with him, so they say. But, in preseason and off season, and they've been really pleased with what he's shown. Look, Arizona are terrible. I think ultimately
Yep.
he'll look great, and I could see him finish as a top 12 QB, particularly if he does quite a bit of rushing and he gets some rushing touchdowns. I could see a world where he finishes as a QB1. My suspicion is then that he won't look as good as that for the rest of the season.
Ever again in the rest of
Yeah,
his career.
exactly. That's my opinion. Now, I might be totally wrong here, but that's my thoughts on him.
It really wouldn't surprise me if kind of everyone is like Sam Howell, elite upside QB, huge waiver target for week two, and then he
Yeah.
never does it again. And like I completely agree with this one. And when I first saw this as the one you put together, I was like, no, I don't like Sam Howell. There's no chance. And then I checked who the Commanders were playing, and I was like, oh, it's the Cardinals. Yeah, 100%. I'm super in on it. Like I don't particularly like Sam Howell, the player. But I am less in on the Cardinals as an organization. It's good fun when Paul isn't here, isn't it?
I
Um,
know, he'd be crying by now.
like
Protesting.
I yeah, the Cardinals are going to be absolutely trash this year, so it wouldn't surprise me if he were to finish as a top 12 QB.
I was actually looking at the week one finishes from last season, and guess who finished as the QB3 in week one last season?
Oh,
I d-
Is it a similar type vibe of like someone who didn't even finish out the rest of the season?
Yes,
Trey Lance?
Carson Wentz.
Carson Wentz?
Yes, QB3 in week 1. So this is
Yeah.
where I know they're not the same kind of style of player, but I can totally see this happening. Sam Howell, boom, week 1, amazing. Yes, really want him on my team. And then
Commanders have found their elite quarterback. Oh,
yeah.
no, they haven't. Never mind.
Yeah, I can 100% see that happen. I
Yeah,
hope
no,
I'm right. I hope I am.
I hope you're right, just because it means that the Cardinals are going to get dicked on. Like,
And then we will definitely hear Paul crying next week. He's going to be complaining to us.
exactly. This is his outlet to talk about things that aren't the Cardinals.
And the thing is, he should be happy because ultimately, don't they want Caleb Williams? He says he's happy to keep Kyler. No thanks. Move along, Kyler. Caleb, yes, please. Although I don't think I want Caleb going to the Cardinals, but hey.
No, I worry that they'll ruin him. But then Trevor Lawrence went to the Jags and he's ended up fine. So like, it can work out. If they're a generational enough quarterback, it works out regardless where you end up.
Yeah, we'll see. Anyway, that brings us to the end of the show. That was so much fun, Lewis. I really enjoyed it, and I can't wait to kind of go over our studs and duds next week and see how we've done and discuss everything that went on in week 1. I think it's going to be crazy. It always is. Week 1, you get players that you never expect to do anything, do massive things. Players that you want to do things, do nothing. It's always mental in week 1, so I can't wait to break it all down with you guys next week. So that actually brings us to the end of the show. Can't wait for week 1. I hope everyone has a fantastic weekend, enjoying football again. Thank you so much for tuning in. Don't forget to subscribe and follow us on Twitter at Wildcard Rewind. You know that we're on the YouTube channel at Fantasy Wildcard Podcast Network. And then don't forget to subscribe to us and give us a like and give us any feedback. We're always happy to discuss with you. And if you've got any questions or you want to put your wild cards in or your studs and duds, please send them in. We'll mention them next week. Until then, have a fantastic week 1, and we will see you next week.
Take me back to the sun.